Shabbat Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Bo, meaning literally go, and it begins with God's commandment to Moses to go to Pharaoh. And we have in this week's portion the last plagues. But what I would like to focus on is in chapter 12 in Exodus, where we have the first time in quite a long time, since the very beginning of the plagues, that Moses is connecting once again with the children of Israel. Chapter 12 begins as follows. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying. Very interesting here, because Scripture makes sure that we know that this instruction is given in the land of Egypt. I think it's rather strange, because where else would they be? The entire story has been taking place only in the land of Egypt, and yet Scripture goes out of its way here, unlike in other places, and talks about this instruction being given in the land of Egypt. Now, the beginning of the instruction is about the new month, and it basically informs Moses and Aaron about these months, and that the month of redemption, the month of the Passover holiday, is going to take place is in the first month, which later on becomes known as Nisan. But a few verses later, we have the following instruction. On the 10th day of this month, they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And then begins, of course, the instruction as to how to bring the Passover sacrifice. And then it goes on. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it toward evening, and they shall take the blood and put it on the two side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses in which they shall eat it. Here we have the instruction about the preparation for the Passover sacrifice, and every family is instructed to take a lamb, to tie it or to keep it outside or nearby the home for 4 full days, and only then to sacrifice it. After they sacrifice it, they need to take the blood from the lamb and spread it along the doorposts. And I think when you take this instruction, and in context the fact that this Scripture tells us this instruction is given in Egypt, we see a very powerful message. Because what's actually happening here is that the children of Israel are being asked to defy their Egyptian masters in broad daylight in a way that none of them could miss, and a way of demonstrating their obedience to God. God is not saying to them, go into your households and somewhere there in the corner pray quietly to me for salvation. He's saying, take the lamb. Now we know that the lamb is the idea of sacrificing or eating a lamb or sheep in general is considered an abomination to the Egyptians. We know that previously at the end of the book of Genesis, when the brothers of Joseph come down to Egypt, Joseph says to Pharaoh that they must live in Goshen, in a separate area, because they are shepherds, and it is known that shepherds is an abomination to Egypt. The Egyptians do not eat sheep. In fact, they revere the sheep. It is one of their gods. And therefore, for the children of Israel to be commanded to slaughter a sheep, an animal that is considered holy to the Egyptians, and yet to slaughter the sheep, and to keep the sheep before the slaughter for 4 full days tied up outside their houses, everybody in the neighborhood will know that this sheep is going to be slaughtered. That is an incredible act of defiance against the Egyptians. And then furthermore, to take the blood and smear it on the doorpost. If they didn't figure it out in those first 4 days what that sheep is for, when they smear the blood on the doorpost, it is obvious to everybody. And I think this is a very important step that is required of the children of Israel in their becoming the nation of God. They not only have to obey God, but they have to be willing to do this in defiance of their masters, because what is actually happening here is that they are going to be replacing their Egyptian masters with God. In being free men, in being redeemed from Egypt, what essentially happens is they will go from being slaves to a human master, to the masters of Egypt, and they will become slaves to God, which of course means that they will be truly free. I find this idea of the blood on the doorposts, however, to be particularly significant. We read in Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 15, verses 5 and 6. In this chapter, we are talking about the birth of the nation of Israel as being compared to a foundling that had been abandoned, and somebody gathering this foundling up in its bloodiness and protecting him. And this is, of course, referring to God gathering up the nation of Israel in its most despicable state, as they were slaves in Egypt. And the verse says as follows: "And when I passed by thee and saw thee weltering in your blood, I said to you, in your blood you shall live. Yes, I said to you, in your blood you shall live." Now, the repetition of this, in your blood you shall live, twice. This verse, by the way, is quoted in the Passover Seder, in context of the Passover redemption. And our sages have interpreted these two mentions of in your blood you shall live as referring to two different, very special relationships between God and the Jewish people that are symbolized or that involve blood. The first is the circumcision. And this, of course, until modern times, the only people in the world who circumcised their children were the Jews. This was the covenant of Abraham. And one of the ways that Jews were actually recognized, unfortunately for the most part, by anti-Semites, was by their circumcision. And the second blood relationship is the Passover sacrifice, referring to this blood on the doorpost that we just read about in this week's portion. There's no question that these two blood incidences are very important and very significant in the covenant that is made between God and the Jewish people, initially with God and Abraham, and with each individual child born into the Jewish people, later through the Passover sacrifice, a relationship of God with the Jewish people as a whole. Ironically, however, it is both of these blood incidences that have been used over the centuries, particularly in Europe, as part of anti-Semitism, as an important ingredient in anti-Semitism. As I mentioned, very often when the Europeans and anti-Semites were looking for Jews, they would identify them by the fact that they had been circumcised, or they would refer to Jews as those circumcised people in a very derogatory way. The blood libels, which were created in Christian Europe by Christians who accused the Jews of kidnapping the Christian children, murdering them, and using the blood to make the matzah, to make that special sort of cracker that we eat on Passover instead of bread. This, of course, was a horrible lie, but that was believed for centuries by Christians throughout Europe, is taken from this idea of the blood, but it is perverting the blood of the Passover sacrifice, which to us is a sign. It is a sign on our doorpost, a sign that shows our devotion to God and our relationship with God, was perverted by anti-Semites to turn the Jewish people into targets of hatred and discrimination and, in fact, murder. And I think it is very significant, the message here, because Jews are called upon to stand and become different. And very often, that standing and becoming different, that putting the blood on the doorpost, has turned us into targets of anti-Semitism. But in fact, what is happening here is that this is creating a unique people, a chosen people, a people with a unique covenant and relationship with God. And sometimes that does create suffering for us. But at the end of the day, it is what binds us to God. And it was binds us to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.